The Having Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies turns 20 years old this academic year. The first conference we convened was held in Oxford, Ohio in March 2001 on the theme of Imagining Russia. A number of prominent scholars came to campus to talk about the state of the field. And we thought we'd use our 20th anniversary in 2020 and 2021 to reimagine what we know through a series of YouTube conversations. Today's guests are Kate Brown and Bathsheba Demuth. We're going to talk about unusual places, no places, floating coasts, and manuals for survival. And our connecting thread will be the environment and how we write about Russia through place. But first, let me introduce our guests. I'm pleased to be joined by Kate Brown, who is Professor of Science, Technology, and Society at MIT. She has written 4 award-winning books about topics ranging from population politics and linguistic mapping, a biography of no place, the production of nuclear weapons in utopian communities, Plutopia, the health and environmental consequences of nuclear fallout from the Chernobyl disaster, Manual for Survival, her most recent book, and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and Narrative Innovations of History Writing in the 21st Century, Dispatches from Dystopia. She's currently exploring the history of what she calls plant people, those who understood long before others that plants communicate, have sensory capabilities, and possess the capacity for memory and intelligence. Kate has also been a frequent Having Her Center guest, one of our adopted faculty favorites. I'm also joined by Bathsheba Demuth, who has not been to the center yet, but I'd like to go ahead and name her a future adopted faculty favorite. She is Assistant Professor of History, Environment, and Society at Brown University, specializing in the lands and seas of the Russian and North American Arctic. Her interest in northern environments and cultures began when she was 18 and moved to the village of Old Crow in the Yukon, where she mushed huskies, hunted caribou, fished for salmon, tracked bears, and learned to survive in the taiga and tundra. From the archive to the dog sled, she's interested in how the histories of peoples, ideas, places, and non-human species intersect. And these interests come together in her recent award-winning book, Floating Coasts, An Environmental History of the Bering Strait. She's currently researching a project on the Yukon River Basin. Thank you for joining me. I'm very happy you both could agree to do this. So let me start a kind of big picture question, first of all, and to ask about how your most recent books and about the intersections between the two. You both cover environment, place, the continued legacies and technological and economic projects. So maybe start by just telling us how these two projects came to be, the book on Chernobyl, Kate, and of course, Floating Coast for you, Bathsheba, and maybe one of the more interesting and surprising conclusions you reach in these projects. Well, let's start with Kate and then Bathsheba.
Well, I guess Manual for Survival is a sequel to Plutopia. And when I was writing Plutopia, I kept meeting all these people, farmers in the Southern Urals and in Eastern Washington State, who kept telling me they didn't feel well and that they were sick and they had this and that. And their families were riddled with all these chronic illnesses, including cancers, but not just cancer. And they pointed to the plutonium plants and they said, this is what caused our illness. And I'd ask the doctors and the scientists about it, and they would say, oh, no, those farmers don't know what they're talking about. And I was confused by that because the farmers knew an awful lot. They knew a lot about the environment. They knew a lot about the weather. They knew where the smog coming out of the smokestacks was, which hillside it was hitting and which water table it was getting into. So I wrote a little bit about this in Plutopia, but I didn't feel like I really got the story. So I ended up walking. One day I was in Kiev anyways, and I went to the archive that I knew from my very first book in the 1990s, and I asked for the records on the Chernobyl, the medical Ministry of Health records on Chernobyl. And the archivist sort of like laughed at me and said, this is a banned topic during the Soviet Union. They started to speak slowly to explain this to a dumb American. And I said, well, let's just take a look. And we looked, and then it did take a great sleuth. Within a couple of minutes, we found whole document collections called, in plain Ukrainian, the medical consequences of the Chernobyl catastrophe. And there are just thousands of records. I realized I was going to be at this job for years. And what was just so amazing about that research project was the wealth of material that I found. I started in Kiev and went down to the province level, and then I went over to Belarus and started in Minsk, and then we went down to the province, and we get down to the county hospital record. I worked with 2 research assistants who were really valuable. Went to Moscow, looked at the sort of all union level, and everywhere I kept finding these same stories of what they eventually called a public health catastrophe. So like one thing, the official story is 300 people were hospitalized from the accident. My count was just the summer after the accident, 1986. Not 300, but 40,000 people were hospitalized for Chernobyl exposures. 11,000 of them were kids. We think of Chernobyl as, the Soviets said, we created this Chernobyl zone, and radiation is safely contained within the zone. And when people want to go see Chernobyl, they go to that zone. It's like a big red flag saying, look over here. But really, when you started looking around, there's a whole nother second Chernobyl zone in the southern Mogilov province, the southern Belarusian province of the Mogilov Oblast. And that was because they went up 3 days after the accident, seeded the clouds so that radioactive rain fell on rural Belarus in order to save urban Russia. So like no disaster tourists and journalists go visit that second Chernobyl zone. That was that there were no red flags waving there. So that area was only fully depopulated in 1999. So almost 15 years of people living in extremely high levels of radiation, nearly as high as right next to the plant. So those are the kind of stories I came across. And I think what I ended up doing differently for this book that I hadn't done for any other book is I wondered about the archives. I knew I was going to get a lot of pushback from the nuclear industry, for instance, people who do use radiation in medicine for curing and for diagnostics. And so I wanted to check my sources because the archive, we know people lie. I could see that people were lying, and we know that therefore archives lie. So I thought maybe I should go and check and see if the trees probably don't lie. And so I followed a couple of biologists who work every summer and every fall in the zone, and I followed them as a participant observer. And they taught me a lot, and they taught me basically how to detect the fingerprint of radiation on an environment. So I would be out in some village or in some town, and people would be telling me about their health problems. And now I was an old pro at this. But then I'd look up and I'd see the mutations on the pine trees that would look almost like a handprint of a storm that went by filled with radioactive fallout. And then I could give credence to those people's stories. Then I could start to sort of cross-check them with the environmental data that I had in hand.
Bathsheba, one of the things that strikes me about the comparisons between the two of these works as I read them or reread them recently is precisely this sort of question too, that as you study a zone too, the Bering zone, and you also, just like Kate talked about, pay attention to stories told by things or people that you wouldn't normally do. I mean, whales and foxes and water play a large role in your own book. So tell us a little bit about how that book came to be and some of the interesting conclusions you reached, or surprising ones as well.
Yeah, so there's like a short version of how I came to write this book, which is that it was my PhD dissertation. And then there's the longer version of why on earth I ever picked this particular part of the world, which I don't think many historians get up in the morning thinking about. And the longer answer is that I moved up to the Bering Strait region, broadly conceived, when I was 18 instead of going to college, and spent several years training sled dogs on the eastern edge of this region that geographers now call Beringia. And my experience there as a kid who grew up on the prairies in Iowa was a pretty radical retooling of my understanding of the human relationship with non-human life in general. If you're in Iowa, you're used to a very cultivated landscape where the capacity to imagine that human beings have control over what they want to do on Earth is, it's a fantasy you can sustain for quite a while. And it's really not a fantasy that you can sustain long in the Arctic. And trying to sustain it, in fact, can be pretty dangerous, as I learned fairly quickly. And so I spent several years there. My basic job required that I was dependent on other animals and their decisions, the dogs that I was working with. And at the same time, I was living in a primarily indigenous community. The village of Old Crow had only a few white folks in it. And yet the kind of marks of the ways in which the Canadian state wanted to transform the lives of Miigwech hosts were very clear. And they were clear in the ways that people related to the environment around them. And so I kind of left that experience by the time I made it to university, really kind of turning over this set of questions about how it is that we come to imagine the world around us and how that world kind of pushes our imagination or reshapes the ideas that we have. And I really spent the next, quite a few years in my college training thinking through that idea in various ways and, flailing around the way that we do as undergraduates, or at least I did as an undergraduate. And then my husband and I did the Peace Corps in the former Soviet Union. We spent 2 years in Moldova. And I remember kind of recognizing some of the same dynamics, because Moldova didn't become part of the Soviet Union until after the Second World War. So they had this kind of recent memory of essentially being taken over and having their way of life, Sovietized pretty directly. That seemed really familiar from, friends of mine up in the Canadian North. However, the thing that they were supposed to become was so different in so many ways. The built environment is different, the kind of ethos that the Soviet Union was trying to instill. So I became really interested in sort of what the Soviet project looked like. And I concluded at that point that if I was interested in the Arctic and I was interested in socialism, I should probably study Russia, since, they have like a legendary, world-defying supply of both. And so I went to graduate school to work on Russian history, not knowing that environmental history was even a field. So I wasn't necessarily thinking of kind of speaking to that particular group of scholars. But because I was interested in the Arctic and the kinds of sources that I was running into, and I think, in large part because I was really trained to think about this part of the world by living there, the environment was the thing that just kind of kept coming back over and over again. And then I did discover it was a field and started to think about, ways of approaching this part of the world and telling a story that could kind of unpack that history of colonization and think about it comparatively. And it turned out that this, corner of the Arctic that I had spent time in is a really fascinating place to do that, because it's divided in the 20th century between kind of the Soviet socialist approach to making modernity and the American capitalist one, in a place where the ecology and the geology and the kind of cultural history are shared more than divided. So I kind of set off with being like, well, there has to be something there, right? And spent a lot of time in archives on both sides of the Bering Strait, and did, much as Kate said, the kind of national level, all roads lead to Moscow and Washington, D.C. at some level, and then you end up in these tiny regional collections, trying to put together some sense of what the process of trying to make these places Soviet or make them American look like.
That's a really good segue to my next question. Although, but the first question, I almost framed it around how does one go from Iowa to the Arctic or Elgin, Illinois to no place? But you both answered that in your own way. And as you just mentioned, Bathsheba, you both write about place in memorable ways, particularly comparing American and Russian uses of place. Kate's memorable comparative history of nuclear plutonium production sites in Washington State and the Ural region of Russia, and your, Bathsheba's, back and forth narrative, as you just described it briefly, about how Russian and then Soviet and American governments encountered the Bering region. So the question is, what in the end do we learn about these comparisons when made in regards to place, and what intrigued you or surprised you the most about these discoveries? Maybe this time start with Bathsheba, pick up where you left off there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the thing that I found most surprising was the degree to which the kind of differences and similarities between the US side of the Bering Strait and the Soviet one. They had much more to do with the ecology in which the two states were trying to operate, whether or not it was a marine one, or if it was one that was more terrestrial, or if it was a kind of mining-based operation, rather than kind of what the two countries would have kind of stated their purposes to be. So they kind of get transformed by the ecologies that they're operating in. So you get these multiple socialisms and multiple capitalisms operating next to each other, which I didn't expect. I thought it would be a kind of either or, either they kind of come to a confluence or they really depart from each other. And kind of on the ground, it ended up being much more particular to the ecologies and particularly the animal species that the two states were interacting with.
And Kate, some of the interesting and surprising conclusions you've made, I mean, not just with Plutopia, of course, I mean, you're so explicit in comparisons and comparing different places. So what has that yielded?
Well, I guess when I was working on Plutopia, what I realized is that, I started out because both these places had issued almost the same amount of radioactive waste. 350 million curies was the estimate for both. And I say, well, that's funny, the same amount. How could that be? They're totally different political economies, of totally different societies. The Americans would be way more careful, right? And so that's why I put them together. I also put them together because politically I thought, oh, everybody knows about Chernobyl. Now I read about Mayak and everybody goes, yeah, those problems with nuclear, it's the Soviets, it's the Russians, it's in the Russian DNA that they would mess things up. So I thought if I added the Americans in and showed how, oh, look, that, why do we have the same amount and explore that I could make a political statement. I'll put my cards on the table in that way. But what I realized is there's no accident, the similarities. It's no accident. They were closely watching each other. They were in an unspoken dialogue, and the dialogue was quite explicit. So when you produce nuclear, anything nuclear, you send all that stuff into the atmosphere and it travels around the globe, and each reactor and each series of processes has its own signature. So the Soviets knew exactly what the Americans were doing just by putting filters on planes and flying them around. And the Americans knew the same thing. And so it happened almost automatically when the Soviets built a reactor and a processing plant to produce plutonium. I mean, when the Americans did that, the Soviets had to respond to build what they called a nuclear shield to defend against the American nuclear bombs. They were sure that were going to hit them. When the Americans cut corners on nuclear waste and just dumped the stuff in the river, dumped it in the ground, the Soviets knew that, learned that, and they did the same because they couldn't afford to spend a lot of money on waste management if the Americans were cutting corners. And so on and on. The Americans build another reactor, or the Soviets test, Joe 1, and then the Americans build more reactors, and then the Soviets build more reactors. And so, what they said in Azovsk, they said, yeah, if you dug a hole down into the earth, you'd come up in Richland. And so that's how I started to see them, is on one axis, spinning around each other through time. And that's a pretty troubling thought, really. We've spent so much of the Cold War, and Steve, you and I are more children of the Cold War than Bathsheba is. So much talking about the distinctions. And in the 1990s, there was like a whole industry of triumphalism about capitalism and American style democratic capitalism. It was the end of history, and I had real doubts about that, and so I set out to figure out why these two places, the technologies bind them, but so do the sort of martial mindset that drove these two societies so deeply.
There's a sort of logical follow-up here, because since you referenced it, Kate, and that is one thing that struck me too in your writings is that in both cases, in part maybe because of the focus on environment, place, and other things, you tend to both offer moral arguments and conclusions, even political arguments. Bathsheba, you close by asking us to imagine other possibilities and other politics, so as not so covetous of all energy and so bent on the fictions of enclosure, as you conclude. And Kate, as you just alluded to, not just in Plutopia, but also Manual of Survival is set up as a how-to, and at the end you conclude that it's time to ask a new set of questions. So I guess the question for you both is this a stance you set out to take, or is it more of a natural consequence of your focus? Maybe back to Kate again this time.
Oh, I mean, did I set out to sort of change the world with my history? Is that what you're saying?
Well, to have a overtly political stance at the end, or almost offer a kind of moral reckoning at the end of your books.
Well, I think I think probably many historians have had this experience. You start working in the archives, and you just get angry. You see people lying and cheating and poisoning other people and doing awful things, and you come home and you eat your dinner and you're angry. So that does come out, and I don't think it's always very helpful for the historian to take a certain kind of moral high ground. So I always tried to think about, so what part do I play in this whole mess? What's my stake in the game? But I guess I didn't set out to be really a professor or a scholar or even a historian. I really always just wanted to be and still consider myself just a simple writer. And so I get drawn to stories and I start figuring out, and I get drawn to the people whose stories are out there, and I try to figure out how I can tell them in a compelling way so that I could bridge, at least for me and maybe for my readers, I can bridge and make the world a sort of a tighter, smaller, more intimate place where we have more compassion for one another.
It's something that you kind of allude to as well, Bathsheba, in the end of your book, when that quote I just read. So maybe you could pick up there.
Yeah, I think I have similar thoughts to Kate on this, which is part that I knew from grad school on that this project was actually quite an unlikely one from an academic perspective. Like I went to grad school because I wanted to be able to think about these things in depth, and I figured I would be paid a little bit of money and given quite a bit of training by that opportunity. But by the time I was in grad school, the idea of it turning into being a professor was a pretty slim chance. I'm very grateful that it worked out, but I was never banking on that, right? I was thinking about a set of responsibilities I felt to this part of the world that my way of living implicated me in from my birth onward, and that most people living in the temperate zones of the United States can keep out of sight, out of mind. And so I was very motivated from the beginning to tell a story that would hopefully give people some capacity both to see the ways that they're intermeshed with a place that is, kind of written off as peripheral and frozen and kind of out of time and, sort of over there, right? And care about it. And some of that was really driven home to me because I was told more than once in graduate school that this project, no one would care. And I think that the issue of caring about something is a technical writing one, right? Can you write people into the story so that they understand that it's a place is worth caring about or an issue is worth caring about? And so that has also made this project for me one about kind of the literary aspects of telling a nonfiction story as much as the kind of historiographical interventions.
Well, for people listening, if you haven't read the books, they're both beautifully written. I mean, all of Kate's books are beautifully written too. Bathsheba's is beautifully written. And you both alluded in your answers to telling stories and desiring to tell stories and listening to stories. So I guess the question is, how does one then write not just about people, but about whales, for instance? How did you go about approaching that, Bathsheba? And then for Kate, tell us more about how one approaches the study of plant people. I love this concept. But first, Bathsheba, how do you write whales into history? Because you do it so well in the book.
So there's a quote on the side of the English department here from Gertrude Stein that says, "Then there is using everything," which if I have a method, that's it. And it's particularly my method around something like trying to bring non-human beings into this story as characters. And to do that with the whales, I relied on personal observations. I relied on, the really long-standing, in-depth understanding of whales that comes from Inupiaq and Yupik hunting communities who've been observing them for thousands of years. And it came from marine biology and the kind of contemporary behavioral understandings of what whales are and how they communicate. And sort of taking all of those things in aggregate and trying to get a sense of, what does a whale's life look like? And then in retrospect, I can say that I made some deliberate choices to start the chapters of the book from the perspective of various animals, but I actually didn't set out deliberately doing that. It just was the way that it made sense to tell a story that was trying to bring people down to be part of an ecosystem rather than kind of skittering over the surface of it. And if you start with people, then you've already seeded the ground to the human beings. And so I felt like part of my job of care was to bring in these kind of non-human elements, hopefully with enough kind of descriptive force behind them that you can see them as things to care about.
So Kate, how do you write about plant people? Tell us about plant people a little bit.
No, I haven't figured out yet how to write about plant people. That's my big frustration. I'm fascinated with plants, and I don't know much about plants, so I follow people around who do. and I'm fascinated with those people, those plant people. But we're real stuck. I think Bathsheba does it really beautifully in her book. Is come very close to the consciousness of a whale or a fox, but not anthropomorphize it, not sort of step in and speak for whales. And so with plants, it's very difficult to find a voice. I think it's like the biggest writing challenge I've come across, is to find a way to both understand, now that we know that plants have intelligence, that they communicate across species and with one another, that they have memory. Some scientists even say that they have consciousness. How do we express that? How do we awaken our sensibilities to that understanding? I think Western people are the ones who've sort of gone off the deep end and have forgotten that knowledge. In other parts of the world, this is, the Russian peasants ask permission to enter the forest and talk about, the spirits of the tree and the spirits of different, have different properties of different trees. And so I worry that I'm trapped a little bit in the society, in the culture in which I live, that you can't seriously animate plants. You can kind of do it with dogs, with charismatic fauna. So that's what that's my big challenge right now, and I don't have an answer.
Well, speaking of challenges of being trapped, as we wind things down a little bit here, we're doing this way because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and you've both written about it, Kate in the New Yorker and Bathsheba in the Atlantic. And in the Atlantic piece, Bathsheba, you ask, from the perspective of being in Alaska at the time, how do we take in the ruptures of a burning world when our own bodies are light? And Kate noted in her piece in the New Yorker that the pandemic is an unfolding global tragedy, but it's also an occasion for thinking in broad terms about the currents in which we swim. So how can we, and what should we be thinking in terms of these currents, connectivity, environments, and health? And how have you drawn on your previous work to write about and understand the current pandemic? Maybe back to you first, Kate.
Well, I think we understand so viscerally with the pandemic that everything is connected. That we swim through an oceanic atmosphere filled with other creatures that we rely on. We don't know them, we don't see them, we don't sense them, but we rely on them inherently. And I think it's a great time for us to start to think about those connections, to stop thinking of genetics. I think has really led us astray. Like there's this hermetically sealed, pre-coded human being that's going off on their own journey with their own will. Now we know that a good part, 90% of our DNA is not human. That's in our body. It's microbial. That microbes actually rule how we feel, the emotions that we have, how well adapted we are to our environment. I think it'd be great if now that we understand there's not just one tree in the forest, but that we can't separate the tree from the bigger forest in which it lives, it's so interconnected, that we should start to think of the extended human in the same kind of way. And I think that's a really helpful and hopeful thing that can happen as we go forward, as we get vaccinated and go out back into the world.
Bathsheba, I'll let you respond.
So I woke up on a Saturday morning this past summer and was running a fever because I had COVID. And I looked at the news, and there was a story out of a very northern town in Siberia that was exactly the same temperature as I was. It's not supposed to be over 100 degrees in Siberia any more than I was supposed to be more than 100 degrees. And it made that kind of sense of connectedness that Kate's talking about really viscerally present. And part of what I wanted to do is to try to explain some of those connections. But I also found one of the most kind of disturbing and to me really troubling experiences about being ill, because I had one of these long haul cases. So I basically ran a fever for 4 months, was forgetting what it was like to not feel that way. And that sense of like ceding the ground to a really diminished, kind of mental capacity and physical capacity also seems like it plays out in kind of in a political sense too, right? If we lose sight of the fact that the world can be better, if you kind of let the ground go, it has really troubling implications. And so my thinking about it was shaped in large part by trying to imagine what are the things that we need to kind of keep our mind on from the past, but to not let the normal become one where millions of Texans don't have power, as is the case right now. To understand those as the product of these connections and the product of the ways in which politics has shaped how those connections influence people's lives, right? That we can steer them in better directions, or we can just sort of let things slowly get worse. I wasn't in a particularly happy place, I guess, when I wrote this essay. But I think in many ways it's the flip side of what Kate's saying, right? That the connections can either kind of make it difficult to see your way through, or they're the only thing that you can really act on.
Yeah, I veer wildly between Kate's somewhat optimism and your less optimistic stance, Bathsheba, which I guess is the most 2020 thing one can say, right? That's how it is. So last question, one I've asked to previous guests in these conversations is, I was struck earlier, Bathsheba, you mentioned you went to graduate school without really knowing that there was such a thing as environmental history, and it's still almost surprisingly in its infant stages in our field of Russian Eurasian history. I mean, there's some great books, of course, and great studies out there, but not maybe as many as we might think. So maybe this is a chance for both of you to pitch some good books that you've read, good things going on in our field, some exciting things that you've found as you've both gone through your own intellectual journeys in this regard. So maybe start back with Bathsheba again.
Yeah, I love this question. So a book that I'm really excited about is Pei Chu's The Life of Permafrost. Probably not surprisingly that I would like a book about permafrost, but I think it's a really kind of, it's a sort of history of science that we're due for in many ways, since permafrost history and science comes out of Siberia to such a large degree. And there's a book, not particularly an environmental history, but very much a place-based one by a colleague of mine, Catherine Zubovich, called Moscow Monumental, which is kind of a beautifully written tour of the ways in which the Moscow skyline is developed. Those two are both really exciting to me. Ryan Tucker-Jones has a book about the kind of global Soviet whaling campaign, which I touch on kind of at the end of my book, but he does it in the treatment that it really deserves, which is multiple chapters, talks about that kind of Antarctic part of it, the international relations dimension of it. That's coming out later this year. I think it's called Red Leviathan, although it's gone through a couple titles, so I'm not quite sure, but that's one I'm really looking forward to.
Well, I would like to point out that one of the founders of the field, Richard Pipes, wrote, chapters that had something to do with environmental history. I mean, I think I would now call that environmental determinism. Russia is big and it's cold, so Russians have these, qualities. But it's something that's been, I would say the environment has played a very strong role in how we've reported and understood Soviet and Russian history. Probably more so than in other, like in tiny countries like Germany or something like that. So I think it's been there, something like that's been, burbling around in the background. And there's been so many great books, and I've been reading a lot of them as they come through for reviews and things like that, and for book prizes that I can't even begin. But I do want to say that one of the books that really floored me in the field of Soviet history has nothing to do with the environment, but it is a transnational history, and I think that's also, I've really enjoyed how people who study Russia and the Soviet Union have sort of looked at it from across borders more and more. But I really like Eleanor Gilberg's To See Paris and Die. That's just just poetry in motion. It's just beautiful. And because she manages to be both so saturated in her sources, but also to convey so well what it felt like to live at that time. That's what I always want to time travel, and Eleanor really helps me do that with that book.
That's a great book and great suggestions. My wish list will now expand in the wake of this conversation. But first, thank you, Kate. Thank you, Bathsheba, for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great to see you too.